we think that the development of AI and self-driving cars, etc., is really important for the further advancement of people's lives. And we think the best way to ensure that development is to ensure that this moral prerogative exists. That's going to be the first part of my case, before the second part explaining why this is actually principally justified. Before that, a model. So we think that this situation is only going to occur in a minority of instances. The vast majority of like self-driving situations, etc., are pretty safe. And we think that the goal, if self-driving cars, should be to like minimize harm as much as it can. But in a situation where harm is unavoidable and where one person will die and another person will survive, we think that in that point, the AI should prioritize saving the lives of the owner and the owner's like families, etc. in that situation. So for instance, in a self-driving car, that car prioritizing its occupants' lives, or owner of a household robot prioritizing the like safety of the owner in that situation. Okay, so firstly, in terms of consumer buy-in, we think that consumers won't buy into these like machines, etc., which deprioritize them in their life or death scenario for a few reasons. Firstly, it's just the fact that these people are self-interested, right? They want to ensure the best possible survival of themselves and their families around them, meaning that given that they'll want to buy machines that ensure that safety. Secondly, we think that people have, to some extent, existing irrational fears of machines, even through things like movies, etc., that make them think that robot apocalypse or something is coming. Meaning that if they then find out that the machine they might potentially buy is going to be one which won't prioritize their lives in every single scenario, meaning that makes them far less likely to actually buy that machine in the first place. The third is that we think people would want to feel feel a sense of personal attachment to the AI things they buy, even though it's just a product. They want to feel as if that AI supports them and is going to protect them in the future. So meaning that if they know that the machine won't protect them in every single situation, we think that they're less likely to pay for the car. Even though what I said before about like these situations happening in a tiny percentage of the time, we still think that's true, but we think that it's likely to be amplified, the risks are likely to be amplified by like media, etc. will say, oh my God, look at the risk of this robot potentially choosing to kill you. So we think that therefore that means that it's likely to be the case that these scenarios are going to have a significant role in the public conscious. And given that, we think it's best if this level of guarantee exists. So we think that, yeah. So we think that at the point at which this motion isn't the case on opposition bench, I think it's harder for companies to actually like market these robots themselves. Like they might devote energy to other things that might promote a greater profit, given that people fear these like robots to such a great extent. Why is this really harmful? Because we think that this could prove the tipping point if this is not invented for companies to not invest in AI. That's to say that AI has significant sunk costs associated with it in terms of the amount of money that you have to put in without getting a certain reward. If you then compound that by saying that actually this AI that you've put all this money into won't even protect the lives of its consumers first and foremost, and so that adds further uncertainty on whether or not people will actually buy it in the long term, meaning that could prove the tipping point for this AI not actually being developed in the first instance. So we think this is really harmful for a few reasons. Firstly, we think things like self-driving cars are in general way more safe than human drivers, right? They aren't vulnerable to the same like toxicities or like drunk driving, for instance. They are just in general way more safe and have way lower accident rates. We also think that robots are more efficient. So for instance, if you have a household robot that does the washing up, that prevents you from doing it or other people from doing it and gives you time to do other things. So we think on net, we want to have as much AI development as possible, and not passing this motion would be an obstacle for that. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from closing.
Why is it a de facto good for more people to own AI, especially if the morality or the ethics of that AI is likely to be skewed in the favor of the owner who's privileged?
No, look, the point of this claim is firstly that people like in general AIs are just a lot safer than humans like themselves. So even if it's partially skewed, it's at least better than the alternative, which is humans themselves doing it. But also the fact that as more and more people buy AI and as it gets more and more developed, I think the cost is likely to go down, enabling more people to opt into it. Secondly, in terms of the principle, firstly, I'm going to give a positive reason why this law actually existing is a good thing. We think that at the point at which you are buying something like a self-driving car, you're doing a public good as well, because the self-driving car is not only more safe for you, but it's safe for all the other people who are driving or walking around, given that the first prerogative of the AI is to do no harm, is to avoid harming people, and it's a lot safer than that human driving. And we think that given that is the case, you ought to be compensated or rewarded to some extent, and you do that by ensuring that in the unfortunate situation where some harm has to be done, that is prevented from happening towards you to as great of an extent as possible. So we think that it's not only the fact that you're paying for this AI, so you deserve something out of it, but also the fact that you're doing actually a moral good by doing it. But I think secondly, it's worth exploring what the comparative in this debate is, because we think that this is prioritizing the owners is the clearest delineation that this AI could possibly have. Not something about utility maximization or something like this, which opposition bench are probably going to assume, because those sorts of morality systems, things like maximizing utility, depend on assumptions like saying that the life of a young person is worth more than the life of an older person because of the fact that that young person has more more years to live. We think that's actually really harmful, partly because of the fact that you're already instrumentalizing people by doing that, but secondly, and really importantly, because the AI lacks perfect information. So it might not be aware as to who every single person is, and it might make generalized broad assumptions about saving young people in general, even if that old person was some sort of cancer researcher or something. So I think that in the split second in which this decision-making situation would occur, we think it was likely to prioritize the wrong groups of people, or even if it does prioritize the right people, it's making generalized assumptions that aren't actually good. We also think that it's unlikely to be this completely cold utility maximizing framework, because we think that the developers who are actually programming this AI have themselves got their own personal biases. They might have race, be less amenable to be more racist, for instance. And indeed, studies of algorithms have shown that to be the case in the past. At least on our side of the house, everything becomes completely equal at the point at which there's one simple, universally applicable principle of protecting the owner in these unfortunate situations. For that reason, proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. Elo?
Yeah, just give me 15 seconds.
Dhruv, can you please check the chat once?
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, cool, I'll start. Cool. 3, 2, 1, start. 3 broad things I'll be doing in my speech. First, I'll be talking to you about why AI is good, why we need more of AI in our society, and why AI benefits everybody. Secondly, I'll be talking to you about why at the point at which we do what OG tells you to do, AI's place in society will fall rapidly, and AI's development and its potential will be massively reduced. And thirdly, I'll engage on the principle and why we think principally it's justified, in fact, to go ahead and prioritize the people, pedestrians on the road rather than the drivers and the owners of that particular vehicle. Why do we want more of AI? Like OG already told you, AI cars are generally safer, and in its maximum peak, AI as a maximum peak technology will always be safer than a human, right? A human is limited by its biological constraints, but the max version of AI that is possible will never be limited by these particular constraints, right? Secondly, AI, and not only in terms of vehicles, but in terms of other machinery, technology has improved the lives of a huge amounts of people around the world, and it has impacted the most poorest of individuals as well. So we have no reason to not believe that more AI-based more AI-based machinery and more AI-based vehicles, everything more AI-based will not benefit the lower strata of society over here as well. We think a world which has more AI will be more capable of providing for the most poorest of individuals around the world. And that is what the trend we are seeing with more and better technology, more access to food, more access to resources, etc., etc. Fine. So why do we think at the point at which we institute what opening government says, you will automatically cripple AI's potential? Panel, we must first understand the characterization of the individuals who will buy these particular vehicles, right? These individuals will tend to be from rich, elite families, right? Because they're the only ones who will be the early adopters to buy these particular AI-based vehicles. Panel, the thing is that these individuals, when they're already in the market for early adopters, they usually tend to be extremely aware and extremely critical of what are the costs and benefits of buying a particular vehicle, right? What I mean to say is that these individuals are very well aware that the instances that this will happen in terms of that you have to choose between the owner and the pedestrians is incredibly low, right? At that particular point of time, we think that in terms of demand that OG tells you they will not fall, it won't really fall because these individuals tend to be more critical and they tend to be able to weigh the costs and benefits a lot better than what happens for the counterpart, right? But why do you think we should go ahead and oppose this motion, right? Understand, panel, that the way AI is currently marketed, the way AI is currently constructed, it appears as a very luxurious elitist concept, right? What do you mean by this, right? OG talks about buy-in. The buy-in that we need is from the masses to make them believe that AI will also benefit you. Because the way AI is currently constructed, with Elon Musk debating about it, Mark Zuckerberg debating about it, and it being limited to the social elite circles of Twitter, it has the image that it's a very elitist thing and only the most privileged individuals in the sphere will benefit from AI, right? What we need to do as AI-based companies that manufacture these vehicles, which are the first lines of machinery that will release in AI, we need to make the individuals and the masses believe that AI is not only for the rich, it is for you as well. It will prioritize you and benefit your particular lives as well. At the point at which you're able to prove that to you, the buy-in for AI will increase massively, right? Because currently AI is only limited to the most elitist social circles that exist in the world, right? At that particular point of time, we think that once you get that buy-in from individuals, once you get that buy-in from the masses that look, AI does care about you, you are far more likely to go ahead and get more research into AI, more funding into AI, like in terms of like government, more like government research, like people will support more government research into AI. AI will receive more funding, more startups will form which are AI centric, right? At that particular point of time, consumer buy-in and especially masses buy-in is the most important thing in this particular debate. And we get that mass buy-in far more at the point at which we say that, look, even we as the owner are not caring about our lives, we're caring about your lives. Panel, look at the viscerality of the statement. That is what we will get the mass buy-in from, and not from OG when they will further make the elitist status of AI even more elite by saying that no, we are only caring about the owners, we are not caring about you. Second argument on opening opposition, why it is principally justified. Two prongs in this. One, panel, understand, everybody as of right now knows that AI's safety is extremely controversial, right? Like, what do we mean by this? Like, there's a huge debate about whether AI is safe or not. That itself points that AI is not known to be safe or known to be unsafe at this current point of time, right? But when you as a buyer, as an early adopter, are choosing to bring this particular vehicle on the market, you're consciously making a choice of bringing something onto the street that is not universally agreed upon as safe. What does that mean? That means that a pedestrian on the road cannot stop you from buying a particular AI-based vehicle, but you as a consumer cannot buy that particular AI-based vehicle, right? Then what does that mean? So as when you're consciously choosing to bring this particular vehicle on the market, which you know for a fact has a lot of safety debate over it, what that then means that you must prioritize the lives of the others who cannot consent, who cannot have any say in you bringing this vehicle on the road, right? A pedestrian cannot have any say whether you choose to bring a particular vehicle on the road or not. And pedestrians who generally expect the vehicles on the road to be safe, I think that is a right granted to them from being in a particular democracy in the first place, right? So when you make that active choice in trying to bring these vehicles on the market, you principally have to also hold the burden of the safety, right? You cannot push upon that burden to others who cannot consent to you bringing this vehicle on the market. This is what they must need engagement upon. Secondly, AI at its essence should be close to consumer driving. Like, it should mimic consumer driving. Why? Because you bring AI vehicles on the street when you make people believe that AI is close to consumer driving. When a consumer drives, you never run into a person, right? You never run into a pedestrian. You always swerve away from a pedestrian. You never run into a pedestrian. So we think that principally AI should be something that mimics this particular thing. AI should do what a regular person would do, which is to say swerve away from the pedestrian and not run directly into the pedestrian, right? Like, they can't claim that AI directly runs into the pedestrian. At that particular point of time, we think that AI at this particular point should mimic consumer driving as well as possible. So principally, this is justified as well. Before I move on, I'll take CG.
Look, if AI thinks that it can swerve and save probably both of them, it would do that. Don't strawman this debate at a point of time when individual who's driving knows that he can only save himself or the pedestrian. Why won't he choose himself?
Right. So again, An individual, you can drive a normal car if you feel that you have to save yourself, right? But when you're making a conscious choice of bringing a vehicle whose safety is widely debated on the road, that means that you as an individual should bear the brunt principally of that particular safety, right? That alongside with the massive benefits you have proven into how you get more mass buy-in, how you get more research into AI, how you get more government funding into AI, how these AI technologies become vastly more appealing and vastly more mainstream in our world. That means that AI, because if we all agree on a unifying concept that AI is a good thing, we need more AI-based machinery in the world, right? At that particular point of time, you weigh it accordingly into the terms of the buy-in. On your paradigm, you only getting the buy-in from the elitist people who already perceive AI as something that is elitist, right? That means that there won't be any popular support for government research. There won't be any startups that are popping up, right? This is the massive benefit that you get on Gov side. On our side, we have proven to you how principally you owe the burden and principally owe the burden of the brunt of the safety concerns, and how you're getting more buy-in into AI, and how these vehicles have become more of a possibility into a new exciting world that I'm very happy to be a part of, which incredibly proud to oppose.
Thanks for that, JPM.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
First, let me explain why we've already won the debate by proving why we're the side that saves the most people. But second of all, I'll add a new extension, and then I'll finally destroy OO. Okay, so why do we win? Because we save more lives. First reason is because more people buy self-driving cars, and autonomous machines. That's super, super great. Their response is that, that's not the case because, consumer buy-in. People are more or less able to weigh the risks and benefits, and the fact that your machine might kill you isn't a reason why people will stop buying. Look, this isn't true for 3 reasons. One, because we think that even if it's only the worst case scenario, we think people will still fixate on the possibility that machines will end up choosing to kill you as opposed to someone else. But 2, people don't use this rational calculus when it comes to buying machines. I think that when they buy a self-driving car, they're buying for a feeling of safety in the same way that they might buy a Mercedes for the feeling of luxury, as opposed to because the speed of the car is really worth the money. As such, when you destroy that benefit, they're far less likely to buy into this. But third of all, look, even if it's the case that they rationally are aware that's a very, very small risk, the fact remains that this risk will be played up hugely by mass media, very simply because we think that this narrative that, the coming of the AI and self-driving cars, the coming of AI and the robot invasion / apocalypse, basically. And this idea that, robots don't care about you human beings, they're inhuman, they're detached from you, they don't care about you, they're going to take control away from you. All of these narratives are something that we think is very, very important to fight against. And we think that OP leans into and reinforces this narrative. It's just empirically true that when Ben's interviewed people as to what they think how the moral metrics should be, over 80% of people said that they would prefer it if the self-driving car prioritized their own lives. For all of these reasons, it's true that on our side of the house, far more people are buying self-driving cars. Why is it important? Because we think, for one, that's incredibly likely that at some point we'll reach a tipping point when the vast majority of human beings are using self-driving cars, and that means that there is virtually no risk of car accidents at all, at the point at which everything is connected to a large network, and the point at which every car knows how every other car is behaving. But second of all, we think even if that's not the case, and a small number of people are able to do things, we think that we are able to save lives even if only a small number of people are able to survive. For example, we think that this means that because we think that this is the case, that every single machine reduces death insofar as every machine that is autonomous is going to be something that replaces the decision-making of a human being. And I think OP agrees with us very cleanly that this is able to save lives. I think that the urgency of this is very significant. People die on the factory floor because of workplace accidents all the time. Also, millions of people literally die every year because of car crashes, which can be very easily prevented. Because we prove this impact, I think OG already wins the debate. But second of all, I think there's another another reason why we save lives. And that's because of the way the narrative about road safety changes. On ours, the house, at the point at which you're aware that it's going to be self-driving cars and AI making decisions, I think that's the point at which people are far more likely to abide by the rules. Because as long as you don't do something unexpected, you're likely to be safe. If you don't do it, then you risk you face the risk of a self-driving car deciding that you should be run over because you have jeopardized the life of their human. But we think that this is like something that is good because it makes people more cautious overall. On the comparative though, if they're choosing metrics such as utility, because that's necessarily what they defend, because they think it's unjust to prioritize arbitrarily the life of someone who's in a car just because they bought it compared to like 5 people, for example, or like a child who has more years to live. I think it's really, really bad because young people might feel invulnerable. The calculus note is not that they think, because that I understand that the calculus of a self-driving car is as such. Therefore, I think I can walk a jaywalk like 9 times out of 10 and be fine. People don't work like that. But what does happen is that they have a subconscious belief that I'll probably be fine because my parents have told me, or like I understand from TV, that people who are young, people who have ABCD traits are less likely to be hurt. As such, when they're in a hurry, for example, they might be more willing to jaywalk. This is really, really bad because even if they don't risk themselves, like, this still means that they put the lives of others, put the lives of pedestrians at risk, so on and so forth. I think that's incredibly bad. But okay, so that's why we win. But now let's just look at why we beat OO, right? So their main argument is that, look, people buying it will be rich and they're privileged. This is bad because we need to make AI accessible towards everyone. 3 responses to this. One is just an assertion that these AIs are going to be incredibly expensive. That's not true. There's a high initial cost when it comes to developing the technology, but insofar as there are loads of different companies trying to corner this market on artificial intelligence, this means that they are more likely to want to drop their prices in order to make sure that they corner as much market share as possible, especially because AI applies not just to cars, but to every aspect of industry. But second of all, we also just think that they can't cross way. We think that's just perfectly plausible that the government will choose to subsidize these cars insofar as it contributes to the public good in the same way the government subsidizes various green/clean energy options. But second of all, second response is just that we think that allowing the rich to buy things is actually good if you want to make things more accessible, because this means you have more money for the companies to have an initial high cost at your best case scenario, which means they have more money to do things such as invest in R&D or lower prices later on in order to conquer the market. But third, because obviously after the rich market is saturated and everyone has cars, you must then start sending to the middle class, start sending to the poor, so on and so forth. But third of all, finally, we just think it's not true that when rich people buy these cars, that poor people think, this car is not for me. 3 reasons why. One, because we think that AI is increasingly less seen as foreign and inaccessible insofar as I have Siri on my phone, for example, and it's becoming something that's using like your weather forecast and technology, all of this kind of thing. But second of all, I'll just also posit that people don't hate or feel like nice handbags and PlayStations aren't for them just because the rich consume it. They'd love to have it, they just don't have the ability to buy it. Indeed, we think that this even might make these cars more desirable insofar as social prestige is attached to it. But third response is just that we think that the desire to protect your family and protect yourself is symmetric. As such, we think that poor people and middle-class people want to buy it on either side of the house. Okay, finally, on the principle, right? What they tell us is that, well, you have the ability to choose to buy a self-driving car, therefore should care about you less than the jaywalker or the pedestrian who have no ability to choose this at all. Look, this idea about moral hazard only applies insofar as you made a choice that was bad. We think this isn't the case because you're not buying a car that is putting the pedestrian at risk. You're buying a car that has actually minimized the risk of other people dying. You shouldn't be punished for this. You should be rewarded for this. There's a key mechanism that Aniket gave that was completely dropped. But second of all, we also just think that pedestrians or jaywalkers just choose to be more careful, right? Like the driver did not consent to this. But finally, I would just also posit that insofar as you have no ability to determine which person is more moral than worse than other, I think that the most reliable way to have self-driving cars programmed is just approximate the calculus of the driver as much as possible. Insofar as these people are self-interested and don't care about the inherent moral worth of the pedestrians around them, we think that self-driving cars should also emulate this in order to keep the influence of technology developers or AI to as little as possible. For all of these reasons, please vote OG. I think we won this debate.
Thanks, DLO.
Panel, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so just give me 15 seconds. Okay, I'll start in three, two, one. Okay, so panel, at the very onset of my speech, I think it's important to take down the principle of the opening government over here, right? What is their principle? Their principle is that since AI driven cars will save a lot of lives, therefore those who purchase AI driven cars should be rewarded for doing public service. Now I'll contest this on two grounds. A, I'll contest the assumption that AI driven cars will save a lot of lives. I agree that AI driven cars will save lives, but that will only happen when more and more AI driven cars are adopted by people. I am coming here and saying that AI driven cars won't be mass adopted because of the reasons that my LO has already mentioned. And what are those reasons? Those reasons are that the media will sensationalize this and make it seem like AI driven cars are very elitist. And I'll get to why the media will choose to do this over pander to fears of a neo matrix coming up and machines controlling everybody else, right? So I contest the fact that that a lot of AI-driven cars will be adopted by people. And why will this happen? I'm going to explain this in the next part of my speech. So please wait for that. Now, once I contest that assumption, now I'm going to go into the intent. When is somebody rewarded? Somebody is rewarded when they do something with the intent of doing some good, not because of some contestable side product that might come out of their actions, right? So let us make this very clear at the onset. Rich people are not going to buy AI driven cars to make the world a better place, to create roads safer for everybody. Rich people are going to buy AI driven cars because they're cool, right? So essentially, we believe that since their intent is not one of doing public service, they do not deserve the reward that OG is speaking about, right? And now that point is contested. Let me go on to the market strategy, which I'm talking about, right? So how does an AI-driven, AI-centric tech company work, right? So first, an AI-driven tech company comes out with a brand new swanky product. That product is of course high priced, and that is mainly for rich people to buy. But once that does get adoption, the main goal of an AI-driven company is not to remain serving that luxury segment. This is not fashion or apparel where you can have separate segments, right? Technology companies benefit when it is made for everybody. That is why they gradually tend to reduce the prices of their products and diversify into more affordable products, right? So when an AI driven company starts, it wants to keep a very good market entry image, right? And how does the market entry image get affected? It gets affected by the media, by government, and by public image, right? By public perception. So how will the media react to it? So I think the OG came up here and said that the media will spin a tale that AI driven machines will control humans and therefore nobody will adopt it, right? And therefore we believe that this will not happen, because what does the panel seem as a more uh, probable idea for the media to react? Will they think that the media will go on to this fear mongering cycle, or will they go and try the more populist spin off and say that, you know what, AI driven cars are extremely elitist and therefore these are made by people who are rich people, and the rich people will be protected even if they drive, even if the car faces some sort of a split second decision to take, they will always favor rich people, and that is why all these companies are elitist. What narrative seems more understandable of the media to propagate? The latter, obviously, right? So now what happens is these AI-driven cars will face a market entry problem from the side of the media. Now what will happen to the government? Once people realize that these cars will pose a risk to people walking on the road, these people who are walking on the road, these pedestrians who form a larger populist vote base of the government, will try to raise a hue and cry about it. Are there any examples in the past? Yes, there are. When Mercedes-Benz said that their cars would actually save the lives of the drivers over those of the pedestrians, there was a public outcry over it, and Mercedes-Benz had to retract that statement. Now, how will that pan out in a government scenario? In this case, populist governments, populist political party will come up and will try to sort of block the sale of these AI cars. And even if they cannot completely block it, they will try to dampen the growth of these AI cars. And therefore, companies will realize that it's not in their long-term interest, because the long-term interest is to hedge against a public outcry against them, because they want to ensure that the public likes them in the longer term, so that they can sell the diversified products to them, right? That is how a company market and study is going to be very important. And now that I've described that, I'm going to link it back to the point I'd made originally about how this reward should not be given, because we believe that AI-driven cars will not be adopted to such a large extent that they can actually save so many lives, right? And now that that has been pointed out, right? Uh, let me go on to my next point, which is that what was our principle? Our principle is based on two things. Firstly, the asymmetry of consent. What do I mean by the asymmetry of consent? I mean that when somebody's buying this car, they know the risk that this car potentially might cause to them. But these people who are buying them are not the common person who watches Fox News at 9 p.m. to decide what his or her consumer choice should be, right? This is somebody who is in tune with the industry, somebody who's probably rich enough to afford them, and therefore we can safely assume that they're well versed with the pros and cons of an investment, and they know that these situations that might occur will be extremely rare and not enough for them to get dissuaded from the fact that AI driven cars are cool, they are a status symbol, they provide you luxury, right? So we believe that they will still go on and buy it. And the examples are people do take part in sport activities which are known to be risky, such as skydiving. They do take part in because of the thrill of it, because the pros outweigh the extremely rare occurrences of a failure of when your parachute doesn't open up, right? And therefore we believe that people will still buy these cars even if you don't ensure that the cars will only save the driver and their loved ones, right? What is the asymmetry of consent? The asymmetry of consent over here is that somebody who's buying this car is getting a lot of benefit from riding this car. The luxury, it's cool, it's simple, whatever, right? But the person who's walking on the street cannot stop the person from buying the car. But the person is bearing the risk of the AI malfunctioning, right? And therefore, we believe that there is no consent taken from the person who's walking on the street, but that person is the one who's put at risk. And therefore, this asymmetry is inherently unfair. And therefore, principally, we believe that companies should not give the consent choice to the person who's actually who should not take away consent from the person walking on the road, right? What is the next point that we're talking about, right? The next point is how it will mimic human behavior. I think the CG kind of misunderstood the answer that my yellow gave. I think what we meant was that this is very clear, that in the cases that there is actually a malfunction and the AI has to choose between the person who's driving the car and the person who's on the street, therefore we believe people should choose the person who's driving on the street. Now, why do we believe this should happen? Because this is what a human being would do. A human being would obviously first try to save both the person who's driving and the person who's on the road. But if there is a choice of just not ramming into somebody else, that instinct would take over, and people often try to swerve away from the person on the road, and in some cases they do it despite the fact that they are at risk. And therefore that split second decision is what we want to implement in the AI without any glitches happening in the decision making process itself. And therefore we believe that this AI should principally follow the human relation and ensure that they sort of do not ram into they do not prioritize life of the driver, right? So what have we covered? We've proven to you how the reward principle of the OG doesn't work. We've proven to you how we believe that a better market entry strategy is available in our paradigm, and we've told you how our principles of asymmetry of consent and the principle of mimicking the human being without any flaws in the mimicry itself is enough reason for us to proudly oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thanks, Club member.
Awesome. Just give me a second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the beauty about human error is that it is human, which means that at a point in time, you are actually ensuring that the way your self-driving cars work are likely to then have a veneer of legitimacy or of complete amount of actualization, a blanket policy which actually tells you to prioritize one thing over another. It's at that point when you ensure that these cars or these companies themselves are likely to face a lot of flack and that these decisions are not likely to happen and that humans aren't able to intervene. We reject the premise categorically that artificial intelligence is perfect, right? Because surely the way that which we live in our world right now, the fact that we are still in testing phases and whatnot, artificial intelligence isn't perfect, which is what the first clarification is coming in from CEO, which means that at a point in time when you program a default into your system, a thing that says that, look, I'm going to now make sure that I prioritize the life of the owner, we think that's far worse than the comparative of actually having some sort of safety mechanism within these features to actually ensure that you are the one who can make that decision. Because given that it's a split-second decision, you need to prioritize or you need to ensure that the human intervention that is going to happen is now not going to be possible at all, and this machine will make the decision for you. That's something which is extremely regrettable. But even if we were to assume that these are very quick decisions, we think that at a point in time when these machines are now able to have their own ethical morality being able to code it into them, that's problematic. Because the obvious counterfactual, which I don't know why opening opposition does not talk about, is pure utilitarianism, right? So the way we look at things in society is to prioritize more people over less people, where it is possible, kids over adults, and so on and so forth. And we think that insofar as AI is still in a developmental stage, it's far more important to ensure that you are being able to prioritize these sorts of things in and of itself, right? And the way that you do that is much simpler, because recognize, again, AI is not perfect. Within that 0.01 seconds, when you actually have a group of people on the road as compared to one person sitting in the driver's seat, you are much more likely to then make sure that you save a larger amount of people, because that's the way that the society functions. This difference or the debate doesn't necessarily just lie on a one-on-one comparison, right? It's about making sure that you have the split-second decision that is likely to be more efficient within the short term in terms of how these things are being prioritized. Let's take CG out of because of the non-extension. The first thing we tell you is but the bystander is involved. So they say like jaywalker is bad, so therefore we must not prioritize the jaywalker in and of themselves. We posit to you or we counter assert to you a simple principle: the fact that right now in status quo AI is not available to everybody, which means that at a point in time you actually must prioritize the right to life to ensure that you aren't being able to impose this sort of blanket policy in of this, right? But the second thing they say is slightly more incisive. They say that but the defense of the owner and the social contract and whatnot is something that the companies should prioritize, and the extent of their analysis is the example panel. You have nothing else on which to vote on, that car companies are likely to give you some sort of like incentive, right? We think that's problematic insofar as you ensure that like these things are going to happen only for like airbags and like seat belts and whatnot, which do not harm other people around you. We think in principle it is important to ensure that humanity is not harmed. The simple extension coming in from closing opposition is a widening of imagination, right? We tell you that it is far more likely that the state is likely to use this AI instrumentally from these companies, and they're likely to use it against individuals that are less privileged, that are being more harmed in and of itself, right? Because both opening houses agree that there are rich and privileged people who are going to buy into this AI, and apparently it's a good thing that we have more AI. All claims in this debate think that we actually need more AI, but insofar as artificial intelligence is imperfect, I'm going to tell you how this imperfection is going to manifest, right? Recognize that the companies that actually develop this sort of AI actually have some sort of like this is the first extension, that they have these corporations within their back pockets, right? So like for example, like Tesla, when the moment it develops, or like when SpaceX develops a rocket, it actually colludes with the American governments and whatnot to ensure that they are actually having this sort of technology, right? We think that at a point in time when these private corporations and the state can actually collude, it is far more likely that the state has access to these particular resources to this development. Why? Because they have an incentive. China and Russia are actually advancing their military capabilities technologically speaking as compared to, I don't know, the US, which is like having more military bases. That's important because the second reason is that these developmental tests are much more likely to then be implemented by states, right? States want to use AI all the time because they think they might use these things in UCAVs and automated tanks and like whatnot to ensure that these sorts of things are happening, or as protester barriers to ensure that people are kept at bay, right? And they have an incentive. The conclusion of all of this premise, importantly enough, is that at a point in time when your AI prioritizes the owner, the owner is going to be the state when you actually have this AI being sold to these particular individuals, right? Or when you actually have this AI being used by the military, by the police in and of itself, these self-driving cars that are now going to be police cars and whatnot. That essentially means that the people or your populace is much more likely to be prioritized lesser, and an already coercive state gets even more protection, right? Why is this bad? Let's actually talk about this, and you need to bear with me on this because this actually needs some sort of like creativity, right? Because the problem in status quo is that there is a clear power differential that exists between individuals. So even if you don't talk about just the state, but like a rich and privileged individual who is likely to be buying this AI, right, is much more likely to then be the one who is being protected. In essence, this essentially means that the buyer of the AI is not necessarily someone who's doing this for the greater good and whatnot, as OG wants to posit you, and has absolutely no contribution into the creation of this particular AI, right? But the problem is, at a point in time when you are feeding this AI within status quo, in the short term, you're feeding this particular artificial intelligence into the hands of the rich, which is something which we concede might happen. More rich people might actually buy these particular things. You create that rich poor divide even further in and of itself. We think that the comparative clearly is that even if you have some sort of human error that exists on drivers on the road, you're much more likely as a company to then program these machines to be utilitarian in nature and to actually have some sort of safety mechanism rather than a default blanket ethical decision making process in and of itself. Before I go on, OG, give it a shot. Shauka, I can't hear you.
I'll take it at your best. The state has self-driving police cars that prioritize the lives of the policemen. Why is it that the saving the lives of these policemen is a net harm?
Yeah, I'll tell you. Perfect, right? So the problem is threefold. One, that it actually harms the minority of the people on the ground who are most likely to bear the brunt of these particular things. Like, think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which these protesters were actually able to come up on the streets and actually fight against the state, or actually be able to overturn things that the state was trying to tell them, right? At a point in time when your police forces used like rubber bullets to actually shoot these particular people, imagine that situation that is aided by AI, which is much more likely to prioritize this particular policeman because it is a product of the state in and of itself. This then means that you are unlikely to be able to use any sorts of violence. Look at the info slide in the motion, dear adjudicator. It actually states lives and well-being at a point in time when it is going to prioritize the harm towards another individual or even a greater group of individuals over a singular person, or even over a singular person which might actually be an actor of the state. We think that's particularly problematic at a point in time when you prioritize the safety of the state in and of itself, right? This also manifests in like the military being able to use these particular things that actually do not care about the lives of millions of civilians in and of itself, but rather the person who's actually driving the UCAV in and of itself, right? We actually think that it is much better on our side when it allows these individuals, these policemen, these military people to make these ethical decisions on the ground in and of itself, that I don't want to fucking shoot this particular person with a rubber bullet. That human intervention is possible only on our side of the house. One, when you encode a safety mechanism, but two, even if you don't, you actually prioritize utilitarian benefits. For all those reasons, oppose.
Thanks, Gavwit. Tuesday.
Sorry, we're in school and security came in. Okay. This is how my speech is gonna go. I'm gonna talk about OO, then OG, then CG, and then OO. So firstly, what does OG tell us? They tell us that you won't have consumer buy-in because people have irrational fears of the machine. Media is likely to amplify risk. But we think that we simply have to defend status quo and CO, right? We don't think media is necessarily amplifying fears of utilitarian benefit. We think utilitarian benefit makes sense to a lot of people. People are fine with this, like civilians and young and old people being prioritized. The second thing they tell us is that it's public good to get a self-driving car. But on this, we think at the point in which you prioritize the owner who could have been in the wrong, it's no longer public good, right? Because you prioritize the owner at the cost of everything else. This looks like, for example, crashing into people because that causes lesser harm to the driver as opposed to swerving off a bridge. And we think that public good is generally measured on a utilitarian benefit, right? And totally autonomous cars aren't necessarily good in that sense, because we can have better cars that aid you and help you be better drivers, that can warn you. We think cars like Chevy Boats by General Motors have 40% of parts altered to facilitate autonomous driving. We just don't think that cars should be able to make that decision for you, right? Thirdly, they tell us that self-driving cars that prioritize users have safer behavior, because and they talk about jaywalking, right? But we think that and they tell you that but we think that people jaywalk. We think that people will jaywalk like no matter what, right? Because like people jaywalk because they don't want to get killed either way. Because even if the car prioritizes the user, you can still get harmed, and we think the natural impetus for you not to jaywalk still exists. Fourthly, they tell us that principally, like people paying for AI should be prioritized. But on this, we tell you that the people paying for AI should not be prioritized due to the power differential. I think our extension deals with that. Fifthly, they tell us that this AI is likely to prioritize wrong groups of people because the developers who program AI have biases and are likely to be racist. As a response to this, we think that privileged developers will privilege huge corporations and actors like the state that are likely to be racist anyways, right? This looks like, for example, police cameras that turn off at the point in which there may be damning evidence against the perpetrator, who's the police, for example, which have innate biases to act worse against Black people, for example. We think that only with our model, when you prioritize utilitarian benefit, can you have a check and balance against racism. And lastly, they tell us that people are self-interested and don't care about pedestrians either way, and they give us the percentage of how 80% act in a self-interested manner, right? We think that we don't think that this is necessarily true. We think that like people do prioritize more people being safe over fewer people, because we have been indoctrinated since young to care about others. We think there are numerous examples to like support this, right? People swerve off roads to avoid hitting even animals, hitting even deers. We think that like just because you say 80%, that doesn't, like, that's not analysis. What does CG do then? CG tells us that technology dies at the point in which people no longer fund it. This is premised on the idea that the only way to get funding is if this technology explicitly privileges the people funding it, right? As a response to this, we don't think this is true at all, because we think we think that status quo functions perfectly well without this explicit privileging, right? For example, like Google's Waymo One, which is a taxi service, is being used in several states. It has a lot of government funding. We think on their side of the house, you lose government funding more, because the reason why governments fund this is because they see it's a public good, right? Because they realize self-driving cars are safer at the point in which you're no longer because on their side, they're no longer helping the largest number of citizens, right? So when WIP tells us that the government will have access to this technology anyways, like, that's not really engaging with the crux of our case, because the US just poured $1 billion into AI funding. What you do with their policy is shift this impetus away from AI that prioritizes public good to military funding, because that's where prioritizing the owner will be more helpful when you implement this policy, right? Right now, it's something right now AI is something that assists us. That's what funding is going towards. We don't need to make those decisions for us, because it'll likely be exploited by people whom to those access is most acts easy and most favorable to. So WIP, last point of thing to talk about CG, right? So WIP talks about what's best for the company. This motion that this house believes company, so we need to weigh up harms and benefits. It's a normative value judgment, is debate, etc. So let's talk about OO then. What does OO tell us? OO tells us that AI benefits everybody. We don't think that this is a big impact as much as they did not prove trickle down. We told you that AI has a greater propensity to harm a greater segment of the population because it is still an elite endeavor, meaning it is more accessible to corporations that benefit off the lowest rungs of society. That harm is more important to deal with than a possible future benefit of AI trickling down to the commonplace. OO also tells us that you only get buy-in from elitist people. We need research to be funded from the common populace. Again, this impact is it's not as important as what we told you, because we aren't talking about the stock market. We think status quo works. We think the funding is likely to continue, and in the ethical way, we just don't want to power this differential further. What did we add on? We told you how development of AI works, and talk about how the people who influence this funding are. We tell you that this process is something that requires a lot of money, a lot of testing, huge amounts of
POI last chance.
So usually the people being able to put in this money are people with huge sums of reserve money, right? Because this testing could take a period of time. These people don't necessarily know how much money will be required. This points to the idea that these people who are pouring funding are super privileged individuals with an interest in AI corporations. And we think we can split it into two groups of people, right? The first is a super privileged, like rich dude that we don't necessarily think are relevant to the debate, because we think these individuals are generally just have an interest in tech, the narrow sphere of influence only for themselves, right? Because they just want to use it for personal use, for example, and they want to push the frontiers of science and tech. We don't think the dichotomies of ethics are applicable here. Secondly, the second group of people that we talked about, we brought you exclusively, are corporations that have huge amounts of lobby and huge amounts of capital, that are incredibly self-interested actors, right? We told you exactly how it is exploitative when used by states. We gave you examples like how the military, which is a great funder of AI research, will be likely to use it to exploit like the people in the lowest rounds of society even more, right? This has huge impacts on civilians, because we think with their policy it's principally unfair, because a lot of civilians are innocent. For example, they did not consent to war, for example. So at the point in which you're always privileging the the soldier, we think you take away agency from the soldier. You think we hurt those civilians even more. For all those reasons, brought to oppose.
Thanks everyone for the debate. That's going to be the end of it. It's a silent round, so no need to hang around for an oral education. So I guess, yeah, final debate for today. Well done. Feel free to leave the room. And